I will build a boat in the sand where they say it never rains. I will stand up in faith. I'll do anything it takes with you in my sails. Your love never fails or fades. I'll build a boat in the desert place, and when the flood and the water starts to rise, yeah, I'll ride the storm 'cause I got you by my side. With you in my sails, your love never fails or fades. I'll build a boat, so let it rain.
Welcome to Wednesday night's Bible study. I'm glad that you're with us this evening. This is part 3 of our study through the book of Esther. I'm glad that you joined us. If you will, turn in your Bibles to Esther chapter 5. We will begin reading there with verse 1. So that is where we are this particular evening. A lot of exciting things. We're going to try to cover 3 chapters this evening. So we'll just see how that goes. Okay? So chapter 5, verse 1, and it says this. On the 3rd day, now let me stop there to say, just to kind of remind us, they had been fasting for 3 days. Esther has asked Mordecai to get all the Jews that he knows to fast for 3 days. And she said that she and her women that attend her will also fast because she's about to go into the royal chamber where the king resides to make all the laws and where he actually rules. And if you come in without an appointment, you could be killed unless he extends his scepter to you and says that it's okay for you to be there. So on the 3rd day, this is the 3rd day of the fast. Now, we also need to think in terms of Esther hasn't eaten for at least 2.5 days, right? And so she is in that weak phase of fasting. And so she's not exactly vibrant. In other words, she's not up to speed like you would be if you had eaten like you were supposed to for 2 days. So she's hungry, and this is the 3rd day. And Esther, it says, put on her royal robes. Now this also means that she was in her mourning clothes. Not mourning as in when the sun rises, but mourning, like fasting clothes. And so she had been in those clothes for 2.5 days, but she's not going to approach the king with those clothes on because she knows that in that system, that is not a good idea. And that is a quick ticket to not being accepted to come in and talk to the king, and she would definitely lose her life. So she changes her clothes and she puts on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance of the palace. So she puts on her clothes, she gets ready, she looks fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. And this king loves stuff that looks beautiful, things that look right, things that look expensive, things that look like they're in place, things that are just perfectly done. And so she, not only has she done what was required to go in front of the king for this court system, she is also doing something that she knows that her husband really likes. So verse 2 says, and when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Now, a couple things before we go on. First of all, the king approved, and this is exactly what they had been fasting for. This is exactly what they had been praying for. So God answered their prayer. I want to say a couple of things about faith because this often happens in Scripture. I don't know what's really going to happen, but I'm going to step out in faith. And the first thing I want to say is faith requires a decision to be made, a decision that would require faithful action. And to follow that up, faithfulness is what matters, not the outcome. So faithfulness is what matters, not the outcome of what you're doing by faith. So she stepped out in faith, not knowing if she would be able to live past that moment or if she would die. She didn't know. But she took a step of faith because she knew it was the right thing to do. And so she walked into this courtroom. And so it continues in verse 3, and the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther, that is in your request? It shall be given to you even to half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I prepared for the king." So immediately I think, back to the beginning of the story where Vashti was invited to come to the king's feast and she did not come. Here, Esther is inviting the king to come to a feast that she has prepared. And this is how he responds to her. Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly," not slowly. He did not delay. He answered his queen's request immediately. He dropped everything that he was doing in order to go to the feast that Esther had prepared for her husband and for Haman. So he says, "Quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And so they did this very quickly, very quickly. It's a contrast to the beginning of this book. Verse 6, "And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, 'What is your wish? It shall be granted to you up to half of my kingdom. It shall be fulfilled.' Then Esther answered, 'My wish and my request is, if I have found favor in your sight, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said.'" So a couple of things. Esther has thought this thing through. She's thought this thing through. She knew a couple of things. She knew that when she went into the courtroom, if she was accepted, that would not be the time or the place for her request. So she came up with this thing where she could invite her husband and then Haman to come to a dinner so that she could make her request to the king in a more private setting. This would ensure that she was more likely to get what she was asking for. If she did it in front of all the other rulers in the king's place where he sat on his throne, it might not would have gone too well. It would have been just a little bit too official in that moment. And the king could then look like he was obeying his wife. It could have looked like that. Or I don't know what other type of cultural rifts that would happen in that particular regard. But Esther knew that if she could get him into her house, feed him, that would be a better place to have a request, to make this request known. So she used wisdom. She used wisdom. I think sometimes when we step out in faith, some people like to rush it a little bit and they want what they think God wants them to do a little quicker. So they start into ministries, they start into things that maybe they shouldn't have started into because they were moving in faith, but they wanted it so quickly that they did not slow down in order to choose something wisely, or a way to handle something wisely. And Esther here is showing an amazing amount of wisdom. So sometimes when we're handling an issue, that does not mean that we have to handle it right away, like right up front. Sometimes there are steps that we have to take in order to handle an issue effectively. And so that is a lesson from this particular passage. The other thing is the meal thing. You know who else also decided to take a meal time and approach people about things that they are doing wrong? That was Jesus. He would go to Pharisees' houses and they would eat a little while, and then something would come up and he would rebuke them concerning the thing that they did wrong. And it was a more relaxed relational environment. And he saw some success in that. The tax collector, Zacchaeus, he says, "Today I will eat at your house." And he went to Zacchaeus' house and he ate there. And then Zacchaeus repented of his sins and became a follower of Jesus after a meal. And so Esther, before Jesus even came, knew that this was the way that she could get his attention, right? So Haman moves on from this particular meal. And in verse 9, it says, "And Haman went out that day, joyful and glad of heart." By the way, the last time someone was stated in this book as being joyful and glad of heart was in chapter 1, verse 10, when the king was glad in heart, merry in heart, and he asked Vashti to come because he wanted to show her off in front of his friends and in front of the people that were working for him. So that's interesting. It brings your mind back to that this might not be a good thing. So then it says, "But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai." So Mordecai goes home. He's upset at Haman goes home. He's upset at Mordecai because he didn't rise. This isn't anything new. He invites his wife and his sons and his family and the people that are closest to him over, and he talks to them about how great he is, how wonderful he is, and how he was actually invited to a meal with the queen and the king. And it was just them three in the room. And he's so puffed up with pride for this because he feels so special that he was invited. And he feels so powerful in this moment. And he's just explaining his greatness to his family. He then says these words in verse 14. It says, verse 13. "Yet all of this, all of his political success, all of his success in life, all the money he's making, being invited to a special dinner by the queen with the king," he says, "Yet all of this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Couple of things. Haman's very upset with Mordecai, has been very upset with Mordecai for a very long time, and in fact is the reason for the edict to kill all the Jews in all the kingdom on a particular day. Okay? He's very upset with this one person, Mordecai. So this is my application point. Be careful with that person that you're so upset with that you can't think straight. Be careful with that person that you're so upset with them that you just can't think straight. Because when you get so upset that you can't think straight, you will make a major mistake. You will never be able to handle that crisis effectively. You will never be able to handle that crisis in the right way because you're so upset with them, you cannot think straight. When we get that upset with someone, I think it should be a red flag that we are self-driven and prideful. It is true across the board. I don't care who it is. If you're so upset at one person that it colors and flavors everything else in your life, all the other blessings in your life, everything that is good in your life, the only thing you can think about is that one negative person, that one negative thing, that one thing that's happening. Chances are you are self-driven and you are prideful, and you need to repent of that selfishness that's inside your heart so that you can get a handle on what's happening in this person that you don't like, so that you can bring yourself from being so emotional that you want to strike out in hate, that you back up a little bit and you get to the place where you are not so self-driven, you are not so prideful, that you are beginning to handle that situation in a very humble way. Haman is not doing this. And he says he cannot have satisfaction with all the blessings that he has had given to him in this life if Mordecai still is alive. You see, when we get this upset with people, and that's all we think about, that one person, how upset we are basically saying that we are better than them. Then you might say, "No, I'm not saying I'm better than them." Oh, yes, you are. You are. If you're so upset that you just cannot get them off your mind, you cannot have a good day because of that one person, yes, you think you're better than them, and you think that things would be better without them. Without them. It's amazing the power that we allow one person that we don't like to have over us in this life. You should never allow one person to have this much power over your joy, this much power over your happiness, this much power over your peace. The person that you should be looking to for joy and peace is God. And if you're allowing one person to usurp the God-given peaceful grace and mercy that he has already given you, if you're allowing that person to just destroy and make everything bad, you have given that person more power than they actually should have over your life. Yet another reason to back off a little bit and get this thing under control, because you are about to make a huge mistake. And a mistake, it's not said here in chapter 5, but we're going to see how it's a mistake here in a little bit. His wife, Zeshra, in verse 14, and all his friends said to him, let gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. And this idea pleased him, and he had the gallows made. I want you to notice that gallows making started that evening, and they built it all night to be ready for the morning where Haman would go into the king to talk to him about Mordecai and get Mordecai hung on those gallows. The next application point. When you're about to take a step of action towards someone, please take a moment to think through the implications of that action, and that if people read in the future that you did that thing, or if people around you found out that you were doing that thing, how would they view that thing that you were doing? The moment that we see that he's having gallows made for Mordecai, we really don't like Haman anymore at all. We see that there's no hope for him. And this is tragic. This is awful. This comes from a deep place where you want to take the person's life that you are angry against, that you have something against, that you hate them so much, that you dislike them so much, that you want to wipe them off the face of the earth. So the question before you do something is this: if what you are about to do would be read by other people, would they approve, or would they think, wow, that's rough? And if they would think, wow, that's rough, chances are you are doing the wrong thing, so don't do it. Mordecai's response to his wife should have been, no, I'm not going to have gallows made. It is not that important. Actually, Haman's response was, I think I can put up with Mordecai not bowing down to me because I'm the most powerful person in the world next to the king. I have everything. I have everything. Why is he so important? Why is it so important for him to bow down to me? Yeah. So be careful, ladies and gentlemen, in that particular arena. So chapter 6, verse 1 says, on that night, the king could not sleep. So the king's having a restless night. I believe it's a God-given restless night. And he gave orders to bring the book of the memorial deeds and the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bagatha and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. So sometimes in life, and I would say more than sometimes, all the time in life, but sometimes in life, important things happen exactly at the moment that they are needed. The king and his sleepless night. the reading of the book to him, the story of Mordecai and him realizing that he had not been rewarded, and then Haman in the court early. God is in this whole process, right? Haman's in the court early because he hates Mordecai, and his hate for Mordecai got him to the king's court early so that he could have a private conversation with the king. So God used Haman's hate to get him to the king at the right moment, to get him there without him thinking about anything else other than trying to get rid of Mordecai. The king has Haman come in, and the king wants to talk to Haman about Mordecai in a positive way, and Mordecai wants to talk about, Haman wants to talk to the king about Mordecai in a negative way. Both of these men, Haman and the king, have been up all night, and both of them want to discuss Mordecai. So the king starts out, what should the king do for a man that he would like to honor? And Mordecai, because he's so prideful and so self-focused and thinks that the world revolves around him, thinks that the king wants to reward him. And so he lays out this lavish thing with robes, kingly robes, and a horse, and being led around, and a saying that's going to be shouted in the streets. And he says all of this, and the king is like, yeah, that's a great idea. And Haman's like, awesome, this is going to be a great day for me. And then right after that, I'll be able to go to the Feast of Esther. Everything is awesome, right? But then the king says, do everything that you just said to Mordecai. And you know that Haman's heart stopped in that moment. He went from, oh my goodness, I'm going to be honored so well, to, oh my goodness, I've got to honor my enemy. Now I want to remind you that Haman is an Amalekite. There's prophecies before this that say the Amalekites will be wiped off the face of the earth. They will always be God's enemies, right? So the Jews and the Jews and the Amalekites have been fighting, right? They have been enemies, sworn enemies from generation to generation to generation. And that is the word of the Lord. In verse 10 it says, then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave nothing that you have mentioned out. That word means, do not let any word that you have said fall to the ground unfulfilled. This is the same word that's used of God's word not falling to the ground unfulfilled. That it's a surety that it would happen. And when it came to the Amalekites, it was an assurity that the Amalekites would eventually be destroyed. That is what that means. In fact, it echoes, if you want to look this up, Joshua 21:45, Joshua 23:14, 1 Samuel 3:19. The certainty of God's word fulfilling its promise. The king is using that same phrase, and any Jew would recognize this that was reading this in Hebrew. It's that same phrase, that God will honor his people. God, not the king. God will honor his people that stay faithful to him. And Mordecai was staying faithful to God. He was obeying God, even he was let me put it this way. He was obeying God even in not bowing down to Haman. So Haman's the one that is going to have to lead Mordecai through the city. Not only that, Mordecai is in mourning clothes, like sackcloth and ashes. So Mordecai brings out the royal robes, and this time Mordecai changes his clothes. Remember, he wouldn't for Queen Esther, but he did for Haman in order to have this happen. And then at the end of this, Mordecai just goes back to his place at the gate, and then Haman covers his head, and Haman is the one that is mourning as he goes back to his house. See, verse 12 says, Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered. What a contrast from the day before where he was having a celebration to now where he is mourning because he has just led his enemy through the city saying the king has honored this man. In verse 13 it says, And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that happened to him. When his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, If Mordecai before whom you have begun to fall is of the Jewish people, that's the Jewish seed, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. Exodus 17:16 talks about the destroying of the Amalekites, and this Amalekite is about to fall. So, while they were yet talking, verse 14, with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. Now, this particular hurried to bring is the same phrase that's used of someone that is arrested and taken to prison. They're hurried to prison. They're arrested unexpectedly and taken to prison. These eunuchs arrive unexpectedly, even though Mordecai, because I think Mordecai was just going to walk there, but obviously he was late for some reason, right? Maybe it was the parade. Maybe it was because he just felt bad and he lost track of time. I don't know. But he was hurried to the feast. And that is a key that something's going to happen that's not so good for Haman at this particular time. So Esther chapter 7 verse 1, So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Then Queen Esther answered, If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. And if we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. So she is not blaming the king, though really it's his fault. It's partly his fault. She's laying out before the king something that is happening to her and her people, and that her life is on the line. And this upsets the king. I really believe that King Ahasuerus loved Esther. He loved her. That's why he allowed her to come into the throne room. He enjoyed the fact that there was a feast. He enjoyed the attention that he received from his wife. Can I just pause here a moment? There isn't a man on the planet that does not love the attention of his wife in this regard. I have done this for you. I want you to be around me. That takes the extra step to reach out to him, to let him know that she still loves him and wants him around. So if you are married and haven't done anything for your husband in a while, do something for him. Have a special meal. Do something nice for him. And think about what he would enjoy and go after that. It really makes a difference. This is, I believe, how Esther had won favor with the king all this time anyway, right? Because she was constantly doing stuff for him and taking care of him. And therefore, the king took care of her. And they had a strong love between these two. I believe that they had a strong love between these two. Verse 5 kind of shows this. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, Who is he? And where is he who has dared to do this? And Esther said, A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. By the way, that's against etiquette. You do not do that. There's etiquette laws, and you do not do what Haman was doing. That was a serious offense. And the king says, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? And as the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that. And so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. The wrath of the king abated. So as we wrap this up, let me make a couple of points. First, your actions will come back on you. If you are so upset at someone that you can't think straight and you strike out against them, those actions will come back to haunt you. Proverbs chapter 26 verse 27 says, whoever digs a pit will fall into it. If someone rolls a stone, it will roll back on them. So be careful what you do. I think it's interesting here that in chapter 1, we have this thing about anger. In chapter 1, verse 12, we have the anger of the king against Vashti. And then in chapter 2, verse 1, his anger, fizzles out. And he remembers Vashti. In chapter 3, verse 5, Haman is mad at Mordecai, which makes him do something very rash, just like the king did in chapter 1. And in chapter 5, verse 9, he's mad again. The difference is that Haman's anger continues to build. It never dissipates, right? It continues to build. And Haman feels like that the moment that Mordecai is dead, his anger will be no more. But he never gets to that point. He is just angry. And then here in this passage of scripture, there's twice that the king is angry. The angry king is angry and hangs Haman on the gallows that was prepared by Haman to hang Mordecai on. I hope I said that right. Got a little confused there, right? So he's angry. And as soon as Haman is hanged, his anger dissipates. Now, of all the anger that is mentioned in this passage, the king's anger in this moment is righteous anger. It is appropriate for the situation. And I think we can learn something from this. When someone is threatening someone else's life, that is a moment to get angry, and that's a moment to get rid of that person. To take them off of the playing field so that they cannot accomplish the evil that they want to accomplish. That is righteous anger. The other types of anger that is demonstrated in this book is anger, and they are sinning in that anger. But here it's being angry and sinning not. I think we can learn a lot from anger just from this particular story. I think there's some ironies in chapter 7, and we'll wrap up and end with these. The first one is Haman begs for his life from his intended victim. So the very people he wanted to wipe off the planet is the very people that he's begging for his life from. And when I say the people, I'm saying Esther represents the Jewish people in this moment. And he's wanting his life to be spared, though he was not going to spare anybody's life that was a Jew, even if they begged. Second piece of irony is, you see it, he was hanged On the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. And we need to be careful, because the very harm that we might plan to do to someone else may be the very harm that God allows to happen to us instead. So be very careful when you want to strike out against somebody because you do not like them. And here's the final thing. God is at work in your everyday experience. If you take that one phrase and read back through these 3 chapters, you can see how God was involved in Esther's everyday experience, Mordecai's everyday experience, Haman's everyday experience, and the king's everyday experience. And for that matter, the Jews' everyday experience. And he moves pieces and puts people in places and gives you wisdom for that moment to act right in that moment. And if you have your eyes open for the movement of God in your everyday normal life, you will see him moving, and then you will constantly pray that God will give you wisdom to handle those moments that he is creating for you to be a witness for him, to live for him, that he will give you the wisdom to respond to those situations in the correct manner. So that's it for Esther for this week. I hope you enjoyed that. Until next week, grace and peace.
I'll build a boat in the desert place, and when the flood and the water starts to rise, yeah, I'll